Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Daily Friend Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer. Today I'm joined by Mr. Hermann Pretorius. Hermann, how's it going?
I think okay.
And Mr. Chris Hattingh. Chris, how are you doing?
Doing well, thanks. Good to be back on with you guys.
Well,
Indeed it is. We've got, I think...
Hey, bye. Sorry. Breaking up. Bye. That's how I react to confrontation. I just run away.
That's a good strategy. It's a good strategy. We are, I think, having quite a typical week in South Africa. That is one of policy stasis, little glimmers of hope on the horizon, riots, and incompetence galore. So let us get right into the first story, and that is that the ANC has been having its policy conference over the weekend, where ANC delegates came together to discuss matters that were going to be before their elective conference in December, where they're not only going to be electing new leadership, but also determining the things the party will be pushing for going ahead. I saw that the anti-Cyril Ramaphosa media, so that being basically the independent group, ran headlines detailing how Ramaphosa had failed to implement a large number of the ANC's policy proposals that it apparently adopted at the last policy conference, things like a state bank, state-owned mining company, that kind of thing, as well as expropriation without compensation. There was also discussion of the step-aside rule, which has become very contentious between the two factions in the ANC. The step-aside rule has been used by Ramaphosa to push aside some of his opponents very gently from leadership positions in the party. And the opposing faction to Cyril Ramaphosa has said that this rule, which says that anyone charged with corruption or criminal matters needs to step aside, is being selectively applied and therefore needs to be scrapped in its entirety. So apparently, during the meeting, Ramaphosa went on to say something along the lines of, well, you know, these concerns are very serious and we need to address them. And the insiders of the ANC seem to think that it will be watered down, which already, as not being a particularly strong, shall we say, curb on corruption, I think that watering it down further may completely defang it. However, despite all of this, President Ramaphosa said that the renewal of the ANC was unstoppable, and that the ANC is charging ahead. It is all well on the way to its sort of rebirth and regeneration. DA Federal Chairperson Helen Zille said of the conference and some of the policies discussed there that, quote, everything the ANC says shows it has no clue how jobs are created. Hermann, let me start with you. A bunch of things there. What are your takeaways from what you've seen of the ANC's policy conference?
Well, I do think Cyril Ramaphosa is absolutely spot on. In the sense that there is a grand renewal of the ANC going on, and one of these days there will be an opposition party. So I do think that is some sort of a reset. If you want radical economic transformation, well, that would get there. So I think the real insight, two things. One thing you mentioned just before the show, Nick, is that 90% of media coverage really centered around the step-aside rule. Which just goes to show that the media really genuinely believes the narrative that state capture was the thing that got South Africa to this place of economic, destitution.
Right, and it's still in this dichotomy of Cyril Ramaphosa fighting corruption versus Cyril's opponents who are pro-corruption.
Yes, it is a very, very naive analysis of what's going on in the ANC. If we want to get serious about these narratives, we can trace them back many, many years. But in government, you can see that Mbeki was the target of jobless growth as a narrative that failed to unseat him. Then there was the failure of service delivery that failed to unseat him because jobless growth and failures to deliver services under Mbeki were just not viable arguments. And then Mbeki was really ousted by his mishandling of the AIDS crisis, and that gave his ideological opponents within the ANC significant ammunition to get rid of him. Mbeki had become an impediment, an obstacle to the National Democratic Revolution, and therefore had to go. Then Jacob Zuma became president until he was becoming an electoral liability and an obstacle to the forward march of the National Democratic Revolution, and had to go. And it was just like the criticism that got Mbeki ousted came from within the ANC. The criticism of state capture also came from within the ANC to oust Zuma. So once you believe these narratives that the ideological factions within the ANC, conjure up against each other, you really are missing the wood for the trees. The fact that the media think that it is good versus bad in the ANC rather than opportunistic state capture versus ideological state capture is sort of depressing. State capture cost us billions of rands, undoubtedly, but socialist-inspired command control, centralized economy, the destruction of private assets going all the way back to water and environment legislation and the Agri Judgment, and now in its latest iteration, EWC and prescribed assets again on the table. These things are part of state capture, whether it's for the purpose of lining the pockets of cadres, or whether it is in the service of the National Democratic Revolution that has a true socialist commitment to that being the way forward for South Africa. So the fact that those things cost South Africa trillions of rands, where state capture in the sort of Gupta sense of the word cost us billions of rands, true, it was damaging, but it wasn't the thing. And to make a contentious point, corruption is not South Africa's problem. It's a cause. It's not a cause. It's a symptom of South Africa's problems, and that is BEE, preferential procurement, cadre deployment, and a massive command economy ambition of the state, so that all resources essentially at some point flow through the control of a government or a stattal entity. And if you can't see that that's the real problem, and that's actually the consensus of the ANC from its policy conference 2017 all the way back to 1999, and then really I don't know why you're in the business of doing this. Not 1999, whatever, late 90s. Then you are buying into the ANC's own narratives. So that's somewhat depressing, and that's my sort of key takeaway, is that the real heart of the problem continues to go undiagnosed.
Chris, what do you make of all the developments over the weekend with regards to the ANC's policy direction?
I think it was mostly treading water before the elective conference later this year. So if anything, Ramaphosa should be happy that potential forces trying to unseat him came to this particular conference and were soundly beaten back from that point of view. In terms of actual policy proposals, we had rehashing of a lot of stuff that came before. I mean, from the fourth policy conference a few years ago, we had the ANC talking about being concerned about their finances. At the moment, months go by and they can't even pay employees, for example. That's one. In the latest Umrabulo policy discussion documents released a few months ago, there was a very interesting item about the importance of communities and how communities responded to the July unrest last year, and how important it was for communities to not rely on the state anymore and government. And I thought, okay, this is coming from an actual ANC policy document, but they didn't discuss this at this conference kind of thing. So they discussed this in their documents, but not at their conferences. They don't vote on any particular reforms or policies that would empower communities and help them actually take charge of their own situations. We had notes again around nationalizing the Reserve Bank. I don't foresee how nationalizing the Reserve Bank could actually unlock economic growth, but maybe I'm just very rudimentary in my understanding of economics. We also had talk about a basic income grant. I mean, that's another way to continue extending cadre influence.
Our friends in Sri Lanka, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, they've all assured us that playing with the Reserve Bank, there's no real problem.
I think we're just misdiagnosing the problem, because if we do it, we'll do it properly. That's the ideology isn't the issue; it's the people.
To be fair, the last time we heard from those people, things were going great, but they haven't been answering our calls for a few years.
Yes.
Herman, so is that when I get that email from rich Nigerian prince .445, that's actually coming from you? Okay, no, it makes sense. All right. So yeah, basic income grant, nationalizing the Reserve Bank, those were the biggest policy notes, but they won't be, I don't think they'll be implemented. It's simply trying to play to the left, maybe more of the ANC, and trying to tell supporters, especially in the trade unions, we're listening, we care, we'll try and do these radical proposals, but they won't be implemented anytime soon, I don't think.
Interesting stuff. All right, let us move on to our next topic for today, and this is that the big thing trending on social media, but also in the mouths of many people. I have a friend who does a lot of driving around Hattingh for his work, and he asked me this morning, what the hell is going on the R21? And it seems that there is a, quote, Tembisa shutdown going on in Tembisa. Rioting, it seems like a protester may have been killed by the police during clashes, and it looks like the disturbance is quite severe in that area. Chris, you at the CRA wrote a bit of a analysis of this morning. Would you like to fill us in on what you guys said?
Yeah, just in the last 2 weeks in our weekly risk alerts, which go out every Monday morning to clients, we highlighted South Africa's potential for increased social unrest in the second half of this year, and that's both based on South Africa's own experiences, but also just economic research, which has come out pointing out that if a country has experienced unrest within the last 12 months, it's almost double the possibility that such will happen again. And of course, we had the unrest in July last year. We don't have the conditions really for assuaging people's concerns about what affects them. I mean, our polling shows consistently that what affects South Africans across the board the most is unemployment, electricity concerns, issues of that nature, not racism, not BEE, that sort of stuff. But the people's concerns aren't being met. They don't have opportunities to earn a living, to take care of themselves and their families. All that they get at best from the state is a measly grant, which goes some way to helping a little bit, but it doesn't really unlock a life of dignity and agency, I would argue. To get that, you need the right conditions, the right fundamentals in place, and South Africa is not getting that. So we'll get more information about what's going on in Tembisa, if there are instigators, quote unquote, behind this sort of thing, who has stoked it, who's driving it. But the point remains, the kindling is there for more and more fires to really run rampant across South Africa, because people's concerns are not being met adequately by the government, I think.
So we're seeing a whole bunch of sort of similar themes coming out of this so far. A lot of the protest seems to be about kind of cost of living, irregular electricity supply, expensive electricity, expensive petrol, that kind of stuff. Herman, what do you make of this? Oh, by the way, in response to what I said to my friend who asked me what was going on in Tembisa, I said, the usual. What do you make of that?
I think that's exactly right. Is South Africans, especially in the poorest areas in our country, have been dealing with these sorts of disruptions on a very, very, very regular basis over the last 10 years. The last time I looked at the data, we saw a 440% increase in these types of protests over the last 15 years. Now, that is massive. And that's one of the reasons why last week I said I don't think Mbeki is right in saying that we're heading for an Arab Spring type of situation, because I think we are already, you can't escalate from this point, really. There's the simmering discontent, the civil disobedience, the civil ontwrichting, what's that? Disturbances or whatever. These things are already sort of baked into the South African cake. And that leaves little room for aggressive escalation that could actually be towards a pointed result of government or regime change. But that doesn't make the suffering of these people on the ground any easier. And anyone that fails to see this as a multivariant crisis really should think again, because we've got problems of law and order here. We've got a hollowed out law and order capacity. Criminal intelligence isn't, in terms of, let's not say criminal intelligence, crime intelligence in the police is is essentially decimated. Riot control deployment strategies are out of date. The units there are to control these sorts of things are underfunded, under-equipped, and ill-trained, badly led. Hierarchy within the police stations and police domains have largely collapsed. So that's the law and order part, that you've got real problems. On top of that, you've got the simmering vigilantism that South Africans have gotten used to over the last 20 years, where mobs really take control of instances of alleged crime. While that one can understand the reasons for it, it isn't healthy, it isn't safe, it doesn't promote the rule of law, nor does it really improve anyone's lives. But communities do need a release valve in terms of law and order failure. So you've got that melting pot there. Then you've got failing infrastructure. That isn't something I think gets a lot of attention, and that is especially rail infrastructure. Many of these protests are initiated or climax in attack on vehicles that carry essentially trade cargo or raw materials. This specific bout of violence started with a truck last night or the night before. Cheers, Chris. And the problem is, those sorts of infrastructures should actually be able to be transported by rail in a large sense, but the rail infrastructure has collapsed to such an extent that road transport, for what it's worth, through these areas of bad law and order situations is even more vulnerable to ensuring these escalations and high cost dramatic events. Then we're not even touching the socioeconomic concerns of the breakdown of family, the breakdown of community structures, those basic essentials that govern individuals within their communities, imbue them with a sense of moral responsibility. Good grief, two Chris's. And then I think I now technically outrank you, Chris. And then looking on top of that is the economic problem of jobs being scarce, taxes being high on those who can, for Pete's sakes, taxes being high on those who can pay them, with basic goods becoming more and more expensive. The way you approach this, good Lord, I think it's what one might use Mervyn King's advice when people came to him, or when people come to him during this time of inflation. Mervyn King was the governor of the Bank of England. His advice usually is, well, I wouldn't start from here. And I do think that is part of the problem here, is to undetonate this bomb. I do not envy the person whose responsibility it is.
No, precisely. One of the themes that's come out of this, what's been interesting about this is just how the demands of the protesters, I think, have not been particularly well communicated by the media. And that's possibly because they're not entirely clear. The one theme that does come through is complaints about, beyond just service delivery problems, of people being cut off for defaulting on their municipal bills and high municipal rates. So we really see here the difficulties of once again, we've talked about this on the show before, this kind of cycle where people don't want to pay because the services from the government is bad, but the government can't provide the services without people paying, and it just creates a toxic cycle. Chris, any final thoughts?
I just want to quickly say something that Rolf Webster in the comments makes an absolute point, in terms of a lower electricity price. That really is sort of at the heart of getting an economic engine going. I do believe that is the long-term stability mechanism. You have to ensure that there's an upward socioeconomic momentum. And that is part of why, as disconnected and as abstract as it might sound, to open the electricity markets, to allow people to compete for the patronage and for clients or customers to have the availability of more stable, even if it is sometimes more expensive electricity, whatever the market requires at that point. That is why you've got these socioeconomic or social problems connected to these broadly infrastructural economic points of opening up the energy market isn't a direct solution to Tembisa's problems, but you can't in the long term ensure the end of Tembisa's type problems without opening the energy market and ensuring that you get that ripple effect of upward socioeconomic momentum.
That's a good point. Although I doubt we will be seeing electricity prices anytime soon because of the infrastructure backlog we've got, which is quite substantial. And the fact that South Africa has actually had, in many ways, relatively cheap electricity for a while now, partly because I think we rely a lot on big coal power plants, and we produce a lot of that stuff. So unfortunately, the government's going to have to do a lot of work if it wants to get the electricity price down, because a lot of the private producers who are able to come online now are going to be quite expensive. So I think we're a long way off. But anyway, sorry, that's a little bit of a tangent. Chris, any final thoughts on this topic before we move on?
Just to ask both of you, because heading towards 2024, and in other countries, maybe in societies, for when people get more frustrated with the status quo, they feel that voting is one avenue, maybe both to let out that steam and frustration, but also to actually change things. So do either of you see that still as a viable avenue in South Africa, or is that becoming more and more distant for a lot of potential voters and citizens?
Herman?
It is, I think, still useful, but we are dealing with a mass, case of democratic cynicism, where South Africans have stopped voting just because of the nature of the country's political and policy environment.
Can I also add something to that? I think the ANC has not been particularly good at promoting itself, but it has been very good at destroying its opposition in messaging terms. And this is one of the reasons why a lot of people don't vote, is because they look at the ANC, they say, yeah, I'm not so sure about this anymore. I used to be quite keen on them, but no longer. But the opposition has not been able to withstand the barrage of criticism that's been leveled against them, particularly the DA, but all opposition parties to some degree. Some of it justified, some of it not. And this is, I think, contributed to the cynicism you're talking about, Herman, is that people have been convinced, and I don't think correctly, but a lot of South Africans have been convinced that there is no alternative to the ANC.
So I think part of it goes down. It essentially boils down to what I think is a fundamental failure to grasp the nature of South African politics, especially in terms of a proportional representation systems. And one sees this failure perhaps most cruelly exposed in the DA's experience of thinking that single party dominance needs to be replaced with better single party dominance. A mass party needs to be replaced by a mass party. The ANC, at its best, was the party for everyone. The DA sort of tried to grow its way into that party for everyone position. Now, the problem is that disenfranchises people, not formally, but ideologically. It would be much healthier to have a system where you have a lot of small parties, each specializing in their demographic, each being the voice of their demographic, not necessarily racial, but all possible. Demographic isn't the right word. Let's talk about constituencies, their specific electoral constituency. And that system, I do think, is changing, and heading into 2024, it certainly must change. If we want to reverse the sort of cynicism, the parties have to accept that they can't be everything to all people. There must be a sort of an ideological clarity, and this is the thing that I felt for many, many years. Ideology isn't a vote winner, but it is a party mechanism for unity. It is an idea for how a party must speak to its supporters. Will that necessarily grow its supporter base? No, but will it ensure that people who might not vote can get involved, because at least they understand the values and the vision of what a party wants to do based on the sort of broad strokes of each policy? I think that's sort of something that has some merit in terms of an argument. So I do think the coalitionism that is starting to develop and gaining traction is, ironically, a slow, but I think the only mechanism to have political and specifically electoral re-engagement to reverse that cynicism is if people who identify strongly with a party can see, hear, understand how they are represented by that party, either in opposition or in government. I do think that reduces the sort of malaise, but it's a tough gig. It's especially for your larger parties, but I don't think it's irreversible, but it is it's not an easy change to make, but I think it is happening. And one of those things that I do think is positive, that we're not going to discuss as a topic, but one thing I just want to throw in there, in this coalition discussion broadly thing, is Johan Mettler has just been appointed as the city manager, or his appointment as city manager in Tshwane has now been approved. That is a spectacular development for people like me who live in Pretoria, but also for the broader idea of a coalition government, because Tshwane
not so great for those of us in Joburg who are hoping perhaps to have him as our city manager.
I mean, but that's the thing, is, infrastructural deterioration is now part of your identity. But the broader point is that Tshwane's municipal government now has a real shot to, for the next 650 days, illustrate what a multi-party coalition can look like. Tshwane can be that flagship project that really illustrates and makes manifest how a post-2024 government could look. Oh, and in answer to Helen du Plessis' point, why does Hermann need a soundproof room? It's because I'm very close to Dick Cheney, and undisclosed locations is very much part of our banter.
I thought it's because Pretoria already looks like a nuclear waste zone, and we can't afford all that hot air to escape from Hermann's room.
No, you're thinking about Bryanston.
I feel like we may be going off the rails here, gentlemen.
That's usual for Joburg.
Isn't that part of the course?
All right, let's move on to, let's make this our last topic, I think, depending on how much you guys have to say. U.S. Secretary of State, so in other words, basically the Foreign Minister for the United States, Antony Blinken, is going to be visiting South Africa next week as part of efforts of the U.S. to strengthen its ties with sub-Saharan Africa. Antony Blinken has been traveling all over the world. He's currently in Southeast Asia, visiting places like Cambodia and the Philippines. However, he's going to arrive here, and he'll be in Africa from the 7th of August to the 12th, where he's going to be leading a U.S. delegation to the U.S.-South Africa Strategic Dialogue, which is being hosted here. In a statement released by the U.S. Department spokesperson Ned Price said the U.S. strategy for sub-Saharan Africa reinforces the U.S.'s view that African countries were geostrategic players and crucial partners on the most pressing issues of our day. Some of the issues which will be discussed includes health, infrastructure, trade, investment, climate change. Blinken will also be here for National Women's Day. Another part of this is that Blinken is going to be going to Congo and Rwanda. So interesting why the US is choosing to focus at the moment. Chris, what do you make of this?
Probably a broader attempt at countering the Belt and Road Initiative. It's not as though the US is particularly concerned about what's going on in South Africa from a domestic policy point of view. But yeah, talking about specific policies, there's still a goers on the table. It's not a guarantee that that'll be renewed, and maybe there'll be some discussion about industrial policy in South Africa and what our government is trying to do with that, and also with master plans. Maybe the US will try and get some tips, because they're also quite big on their industrial policy and semiconductor chips, and they're very worried about that whole issue. But yeah, I think it goes to show that Africa is pretty low down on the priority list. This comes after visits to many other locales and capitals over the last 2 years from the Biden administration. I don't think it'll signal a particularly big shift in terms of US policy in Africa. They'll want to maintain influence and possibly strengthen it slightly, but they also won't want to give away too much in terms of simply asking African governments what they only want. I don't think it's going to be a huge sea change as such.
Herman, very briefly, your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think Chris is, of course, right. One thing that we should also consider is South Africa's rather outsized role in the intellectual property debate surrounding vaccines during the COVID crisis. It was another opportunity to blame property rights or secure property rights for something, and I do think that sounded some alarm bells for the US. I've spoken to people within the industry who say that within the big pharmaceutical industry that say South Africa is like 1% of their consumer base, but 10% of their problems. So there might be, in light of these developments with COVID over the last few years, there might be a deliberate push to at least get South Africa to either shut up about such idiotic ideas, or perhaps more constructively, as Chris says, ensure some proper ideological counter to an increasingly, Belt and Road type of future for countries, especially African countries, that find themselves in fiscal hellholes, or another Trumpian term, but that is not appropriate to air.
Yes. All right. I think that is it for today. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening. We hope that you found the show interesting. We will, of course, be back tomorrow. We don't have an episode this Thursday. I know I promised on last Thursday that we were going to have a special edition about the life of John Kane Berman. That has been postponed, but it will be coming down the pipeline, but it's quite a ways yet still. We won't be here on Thursday because we are attending the funeral of John Kane Berman. But anyway, thank you very much, everyone, for listening, and we will see you soon on the Daily Friend Show. Cheers, everyone.